This really is one of the more important differences. I would say probably the core difference, that as it were, one world is real, vibrant, unknown in part, only known ever to a degree, and ever more coming into being and ever more coming into knowledge for the right hemisphere. And for the left hemisphere, already cold, finished, known, dead, put in a book, stuffed on the shelf, filed away. And we now live so much in this virtual represented world, partly because we're very much cut off from nature, which constantly reminds you of its vivid, uncertain liveliness. It confronts you with its audacious beauty and vitality all the time, partly because we've learnt to cut our minds off from our bodies. And so we think in this enormously abstract way, and partly because of city life, partly because of technology, which means we interact with two-dimensional screens rather than the three-dimensional depth, which is in a room when you're with someone, which is why, as you know, and I know, because we've both helped patients in our time, that it's very important to be in the room with the patient. It's a completely different thing that happens from anything you can do on the telephone or even like this.
So part of the philosophical case that you're making is, I believe, that, well, we have a terrible conundrum as human beings. We need, in some sense, for the purposes of efficiency, to move towards the most efficient representations possible. And this has real bearing on the nature of perception itself. So I know, for example, that even in the primary visual cortex, so in principle, you know this, but I'm going to explain it for people who are listening. As the pattern signals from your retina move back towards your brain, they move upwards, so to speak, through a hierarchy of processing units. And even at the first stages of that processing, there's still more top-down input from other brain centers than there is input from the retinal structures themselves. And so what that implies is that even at the beginnings of perception, you know, if you think about it as being built up from perceptual elements up towards the whole gestalt, which isn't exactly accurate, but it'll do for now. Even at the beginnings of the visual process, there's more input from what's inside than there is from the external world, so to speak, or at least as much. And then what seems to happen as we age is that increasingly that perception becomes solipsistic. And so we're only seeing what we know. And that's extraordinarily efficient because it's very hard to build up a new perception. You have to really investigate something in detail to see it anew. Whereas if it's the same old thing that you've seen 10,000 times, you can already use what you know. And it's not surprising you'd be annoyed if you were forced to jump out of that, because there's a tremendous amount of work that has to be done if you want to see something for the first time again.
Well, as we both know, people would rather deny obvious truths than let go of a cherished belief. So that's certainly right. And we don't perceive the world as, in a naive way. We come to the world with our history, with our vast range of experience. And so, as you say, there's top-down effects on the lower end of things, or the lower end of perception from higher cognitive functions. But that's an image of something very important to the philosophy I try to put across in The Matter with Things, which is that in order to understand any element in experience, it's at least as important to see what holes it goes to make up, or potentially can go to make up, as it is to see what it turns into when you break it down. In fact, often it's not very revealing to find out what happens when you break it down. And so in a way,
psychology suffers from that. It's like psychology is a discipline that consists, at least in its present form, mostly of disparate experiments which demonstrate very particular things about people, about how people behave in very particular circumstances. But there's nothing, there's very little that unites that back up to something that isn't merely fragmentary observation. And so it's very difficult to get a grip on. And there's billions of potential separate observations. And they're not that helpful in some sense.
Well, it's all part of the world picture, which from the philosophical point of view, is the purpose of the long book, which I sent to you in manuscript, The Matter with Things. Effectively, I can state quite simply that I want to give a considered response to the philosophy of our age, which is that there is only matter and that things are understood by reducing them to their parts, and this doesn't change them. It's a very naive philosophy. It's simplistic and it's immoral because it changes the way we treat the world and other people and nature. It changes our idea of who we are in a very damaging way, ruling out things that other traditions have traditionally held as very powerful. And, you know, coming back to your comment about how people cling on to things that they believe, and it's much more difficult to try and see something in a different way, especially with age. This is why, of course, most traditions of spiritual growth enjoin on the person paradoxes, to see things in a completely new way that violates all the ways that they thought they knew. So I use paradox in this new book, but not in some blind way. In fact, I show that what we mean by a paradox is that the view of the left hemisphere of something and the view taken of the right hemisphere of the same thing can never actually completely marry up. They have different qualities, and if you push the comparison or the desire to make them logically come together too far, you end up with a paradox. And this started happening, you know, early on in the Greek, the ancient Greek period of philosophy with Zeno. This is where the first paradoxes come from. And I have a whole chapter on paradox, which I see as generated by the desire of the left hemisphere to say it must be this or it must be that, clinging on preferentially to the very fragmentary view of the left hemisphere. See, the left hemisphere is not good at understanding. That sounds a very blanket statement, and it is. But the whole of the first part of that book, the new book, is massively more thorough neuropsychology than is in The Master and His Emissary. So it's about as thorough as I could possibly make it. And what I do is I look at the ways in which we have any chance of getting an idea of what the world is. What are the portals of entry of, if you like, information about the world to us? And I take it that it depends very much on our attention, how we dispose our attention, perception, the judgments we form on the basis of perception, the ways in which we apprehend what we're dealing with rather than comprehend it. In other words, grasp it, as we say, with the right hand of the left hemisphere, take it, use it. How we understand it in terms of emotional intelligence, which is not a small thing. It's the whole way in which we understand everything human. By emotional, I don't mean sort of in some, you know what I mean. I'm talking about social and emotional understanding, the sort of thing that is absent in people with autism. And cognitive intelligence, this may surprise people, but that all these things, and creativity. So creativity, intelligence of the cognitive kind, IQ kind, emotional and social intelligence, apprehension is a separate case. I'll come to that in a second. Perception, attention, and judgment. All these are better performed by the right hemisphere. Only apprehension is better performed by the left hemisphere. So the only thing the left hemisphere is better at is getting a hold on either an idea, very precise, clear one, or on a thing that it wants to use. But all the manifold complexity which our intelligence brings to bear in order to understand the world, all of that is better done by the right hemisphere. And I can say that on the basis not just of experiments in normal subjects, but on seeing what happens when you have either left hemisphere damage or right hemisphere damage. To summarize a vast chunk of information, which I hope will be, you know, there for people to read very, very soon. To summarize that very briefly, what one would say is that when you have damage to the right hemisphere, your grasp of reality is the main thing that's impaired. You don't understand it, you don't connect with it. Your ability to understand what's going on disappears. Whereas when you have a right hemisphere, that's when you have a right hemisphere stroke. When you have a left hemisphere stroke, the main things are you have difficulty speaking and using your right hand. They're practically very important, but essentially the understanding of the world, the grasp of the meaning of the world. So we have to use these words grasp occasionally, but the overall comprehension of the world is sustained by the right hemisphere.
Okay,
now,
so let me ask you a question.
Can I?
Sure, go ahead.
All right, okay.
And then yeah.
All right, okay. Let me just make this point.
Yep.
Because I want to, people might say, well, okay, but so what? We've both got right and left hemispheres, so we're not missing anything. So does it matter? Well, yes, it matters very importantly for my philosophical project. Because as I show in the second part of the book, where I look at the proper contributions to understanding made by reason, science, intuition, and imagination, what I can show is that in those attempts to grasp, we can see the world, we can see the signature of the right hemisphere or the signature of the left hemisphere on a particular model. So if we have two possible models of a certain action or an aspect of reality or of space or time, which I deal with in the third part of the book, and indeed in philosophical history and in the history of physics and so on, there have tended to be opposing views of the world. Once you know how the left hemisphere sees it and how the right hemisphere tends to see things, you can see the hallmark of the left hemisphere's understanding on a certain philosophical standpoint, on a certain scientific take of the world. And you can see the hallmark and the imprint of the right hemisphere in certain other ways of reasoning and of science and philosophy. So this is very important because up till now, we've never been able to judge between these two. We've got A, we've got B, we just have to go, can't tell, we can't reconcile them, we can't do without either of them. That's true. Ultimately, that's true, but we can get a very sharp idea, I believe now, of which of these is fallacious, which one is going to lead us down a blind alley, which one is out of touch with reality, and which one is more in touch with reality. I just wanted to say that because it's behind the whole philosophical drift of my book, which is how do we know who we are? I asked Plotinus's question, who are we? That's effectively the question. What is the cosmos? What is nature? And how do we all relate?